Hi, everybody, and welcome to this episode of the Conscious Grief series. Today, I am joined by Emma Conally-Barklem, who is a yoga teacher and a writer. Welcome, Emma.
Hi.
Nice to have you here, Emma. Emma's a fellow yogi, and we've met through following one another on Instagram. And Emma's got a really strong following of people who enjoy reading your writing, your poetry, and obviously following your classes in yoga as well, and your journey through grief, which has been a lot of grief in the last 8 years or so.
Yeah, certainly has. Yeah.
So I know that your dear mum Kathleen died, but before that your grandma died as well, who was extremely important part of your life. So these were the two major griefs and the major people in your life. So I just wondered if you could first begin telling us about them, about what happened and how the grief impacted you.
Okay, so my grandma was my mum's mum. This is a Caucasian side of the family from Yorkshire. And yeah, I was very close to my grandma. So I suppose like a lot of daughters, my grandma looked after me while my mum was working, and we were very close from me being a little girl. And I suppose the interesting thing is my great grandma had just died just before I was born. So all my grandma's love and attention kind of went into me and bringing me up. So 2012, and she died of natural causes. And people say unhelpful things, don't they? Like, oh, well, she lived to a good age and things like that, as if that somehow lessens the grief. But she did live to a good age. She was in her 90s when she died. And I actually held the space for her to die in a 2-week period in the hospital. So I basically was out of work, took time off work, and was by her bedside talking to her and kind of in that process with her. So that was quite intense. I was a lot younger then. And it was my first real experience of what I call, proper grief. So it hit me very, very, very hard. I didn't have the resources to deal with it, especially, although I did have my mum, of course, and we were both very close to her, so I could talk to her about it. And I did that thing where you try and keep everything that they ever owned and kind of memorialize it. So I kind of created this shrine in my house to her, which in hindsight wasn't particularly helpful. It become quite a dark space. So that was the first big loss. And my mum died 6 years later of a rare cancer, which was a stage 4 cancer. She was diagnosed 2 years before she died. So she was going through what you'd expect, all the usual cancer treatments. At one point, she was declared to have been free of cancer. And she spent a Christmas, we were celebrating, but then it came back very aggressively. So she died July 2018, which, has been the most painful thing in my life. I know you understand this, Tara. Me and my mum were best friends, very close. We literally spoke to each other every day. At the time that she died, my life was really busy with yoga. I was teaching retreats around the world. I was on magazines. I was kind of very busy. So I was juggling that as well as traveling down the motorway to be with her and just back and forth. So it's quite an exhausting process. So then she actually managed to write one entry into her diary. My auntie had bought her this diary and journal just to record her thoughts, really to help her, because obviously she's very anxious. She knew what was happening and she had panic attacks about it. So she managed to write one entry, and then she died shortly after. So I kind of made a promise that I would finish the journal for her. So I started writing in the journal. But I continued to run away from the grief for quite a long time. I just immersed myself in yoga, and you swallow all the unhelpful narratives that we're told in society. You need to stay strong. You need to keep busy. Time will heal. All these things that I now know to be nonsense. So I did all of that. I'd always had issues with my back, which was one of the reasons I'd started yoga 20 odd years ago. So then my back completely went. I'd had little episodes, and then it completely went to the point that I had to go to hospital with it. I was incapacitated, couldn't move for about 3 weeks. And I know now that was the grief. That was all the unexpressed, held grief that was in my body. So I was kind of forced down to ground zero, really, and to start to reflect. But to be honest, once I started to get better, I just started to build up again, working, etc., etc. And it wasn't really until the pandemic, where everybody had to stop, that the grief really hit me. And this is 2 years later that the grief hits me. I had to sit with the grief. I had to face it. And I realized that I wasn't coping very well. I'm not close to the rest of my family. My mum and my grandma were the two members I was closest to. So my family were of no help with the grieving process. So that was quite a lonely experience. And of course, we know pandemic and lockdown was a lonely experience for most of us. So that kind of compounded it. So although the yoga was, has always been my tool, a healing tool, really helpful in my life, it wasn't enough to deal with the grief. So I made what was a difficult decision for me to seek help externally and to go to therapy, and obviously online. So I eventually found a therapist who could break through all the barriers that I put up. And she's great. And that really is the point when I started to face the grief and accept all the emotions that come with having lost someone, which I think I'd been burying for a long time. So so that's kind of, and then I continued to write and write and write. And then that turned into, my mum's journal turned into the memoir, You Can't Hug a Butterfly. At which point I realized, I've gone back to writing. And I'd not written for 20 years because I'd always said that I can only write when I'm sad. So I was very sad with the grief. And then I joined Instagram. I'd never been on social media before 2020 and not even had Facebook or anything. I can't remember how. I think initially it was to everyone. All the yoga teachers had to go on Zoom, didn't we? And we had to, try and keep our students going. So it kind of came out of that. I thought Instagram would be a good marketing tool for yoga, but then I found that Instagram was a lot more than I'd realized. I thought it was all bikini shots and breakfast. A grief community there, including yourself. And I can remember watching, it might be in the first Conscious Griefs series that you put out, and I was receiving all these emails, and it was such a lifeline to me because I'd had no kind of help. I thought I was going crazy. I was like, why am I feeling like this? And it was just so good to listen to all those women tell their stories and how they were dealing with it and how they were processing it. So Instagram was also a big lifeline for me, the grief community on there. Then I met the poet community, and then I started writing poetry, and that took off. So all these things really kind of started to help me to process and deal with the grief. And that really is where I'm at the moment.
Wow, Emma, that's amazing listening to your, journey of traversing grief. And I always say to people how social media, gets a really bad rap in many circumstances. But I do think the grief community and for, being able to relate to each other and not feeling that loneliness, it's kind of remarkable in that way. And it's incredible how you have created like a really big community for yourself in a short space of time. It's awesome. It's been really amazing to witness because I remember seeing you. I also started an account at the similar time as you, and I can see how it's really blossomed and been a support. Like that was at the same time that you really started excavating your grief. And I so relate to what you were saying about staying busy and not dealing with it. And we push it down, we repress it. And it is amazing how, well, for you, it was your back. That was one of the real trigger points. But also, as you mentioned, the pandemic, like having that time and space in your life and sometimes I say to people, like, you just don't know when you're going to get that time and space in your life, because it could come 2 years after, it could be 20 years after, you know, but there will come a time where you have more space where to be able to feel, because our life is so constructed around staying busy and not having that space, which is so important if you can create it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's a good wake-up call for me. I think a lot of people's priorities changed as a result of the pandemic. And I realized through having a period really of deep rest and reflection that I needed more of that. And that the grief was exhausting. That was the other thing that I hadn't realized, that grief is exhausting. And probably the reason I got to such a low ebb was because I was exhausted, and I hadn't acknowledged that, you know, because each time you have a grief wave or a grief, you know, you're kind of undone by grief, you have those moments out of the blue. It's kind of quite a long recovery period to feel back to however you felt before. And obviously it's invisible, so people don't realize that, you know. And there's the grief brain where you forget everything, or you forget what people have just told you, and people get frustrated with that. And why can't you remember this? Why can't you know? Because your brain, it's like you've been rewired, you know. And there's all these aspects which I really found helpful, brought to my attention by the grief community, you know, and lists of things not to say to people who are grieving. And, you know, looking through those lists and seeing that everybody had said those things to me. And also I'd said them to other people. That was another realization, and having to rewire myself from kind of all these unhelpful messages I'd absorbed from society. You know, there's times even during the pandemic, I caught myself saying something, you know, to somebody who'd lost somebody, one of my students, and then drawing back and saying, no, there is no at least about this. There is no at least, you know. And so it was also an education for myself as well, you know, and that was really useful. But yeah, I think I find it very difficult to rest, very difficult. So that's something that I'm continuing to practice doing, because I know that that's what I need to do. The hard thing is what I need to do.
Yeah. I feel like for me in yoga classes, Shavasana can be the hardest pose. And
yes, yeah. Just to lay there and do nothing.
Yeah.
Because in a way you have to be with yourself, don't you? And if you're grieving, sometimes you don't want to do that. You know, you want a distraction. It's easier to be distracted. Absolutely. But if you're going to deal with it, then you need to face all the uncomfortable emotions. And what was brought home to me, even after all those years of practicing yoga, was all the lessons about grief that are inside yoga, you know, about self-acceptance, about there not being any negative emotions. Anger is as valid as joy, you know, and all those kind of lessons that I talked about a lot in my classes, you know, studied, I kind of felt for the first time, which was humbling, but also confirmed to me that yoga as well is a lifelong journey. You know, you never stop learning and evolving with it. And the grief was just another chapter, you know.
Right. And as you said, these most painful circumstances of your life, you know, your mum and your grandma, the two people that are the most important people in your life. But you've come to realize, you know, that you've learned things through that already, you know, like you're saying with the yoga practice, like you've had an experiential experience now of how the things that perhaps you spoke about in your classes, like you have a much deeper understanding of now. And I think that that's, you know, where grief can be so poignant and so powerful. And I loved what you shared earlier about I hadn't written for so long because I always said that I wrote when I was in pain. And again, you know, that's why so many sort of like great love songs about heartbreak and things, you know, get made when people are suffering and in pain, because we can create in pain. We can create things that, you know, bring about our most powerful moments in a sense.
Yeah. And it's the catharsis in that. As soon as after my first therapy session, I just wrote and wrote and wrote, and I haven't stopped writing really, and good things have come from it, because I just wouldn't have gone back to writing without my mother's death. And obviously I would prefer my mum to be here and not a writer, but at the same time, I've got a collection coming out. I'm writing all this poetry. All this writing is pouring out of me. And I know it's part of, because a lot of the collection that I've got coming out next year, there's at least 3 grief poems in there. I've got a whole separate section on my mum and grief poems, and a lot of it was this cathartic therapeutic process and kind of coming to terms with the past, I think, and kind of making peace through the process of writing with that. And as things come up, then writing them out. So it's become really cathartic process for sure.
Yeah. So writing and yoga, and yeah. And I know that, you said that your mom's side of the family were from Yorkshire and your dad is from Jamaica.
Yeah.
And so I had listened to something on one of your Instagram stories, and you were talking about how when you were little, you went to Jamaica and you saw a funeral, and then you compared it to how your dad experienced it here after living in the UK for a very long time. So I would love to hear about that experience, for you to share that with the listeners, because I think these cultural differences and these observations are really interesting.
Mm-hmm. So in Jamaican culture, when somebody dies, traditionally in Jamaica, then there's kind of an open house. So family members, friends will come over about 2-3 week period, bringing food, crying with the people, reminiscing memories, telling stories. And the person is, the body will be there laid out, and people will visit and say what they need to say. And there's this whole kind of process which is out in the open, where things are expressed. There's lots of singing, and which I think is really healthy, and also helps the person to feel really supported. So obviously my dad left Jamaica when he was a young boy, so he's more immersed in British culture now than he is in the Jamaican culture. So his response was very much like a lot of people's. He was obviously lost his wife for 50 odd years. So there's a lot of denial and will not talk about it. So the people I needed to talk to, my brother and my dad, couldn't really talk about it. It's only very recently they started to talk about it, but at the point I needed it, they couldn't. So you've got the two cross-cultural things there. Also, my partner is Hungarian, so I'd experienced quite a lot. I'd experienced a funeral in Hungary on All Saints' Day, which I wrote about in the memoir. And again, in that culture, I find it a lot healthier. So on All Saints' Day, which is the day after Halloween, we make a big deal out of Halloween. All Saints' Day is big in Eastern Europe. So everyone goes to the graveyard, they exchange stories, they bring flowers and tributes to their loved ones. We have toasts. And I say we now because I'm part of this family. I'm part of this family, we're engaged. And yeah, I have a Hungarian mama now, which is really nice. But yeah, it's really healthy, and my mother-in-law, she talks about who's died. She goes to visit them. She pays tribute to them. She has a candle on the grave from my partner's father who died, for my mum. So everybody who's died in the families are honoured. And and then all candles are lit. So when you drive past in the evening, there's just an array of candle and light coming from all the graveyards, which I think is a really beautiful tribute. And they look amazing, the flower tributes and everything. You can go and specifically buy these things for this day. So again, it was like a healthier approach, and probably an approach which may have been taken, say, in the UK maybe 50, 60 years ago when All Saints' Day was, observed. So I wrote about that as well. And obviously, I do think it's interesting to look at how grief operates in different cultures. So I'd had the exposure to the Jamaican and now the Hungarian. And I do think those processes are much healthier than the British stiff upper lip and sweep everything under the carpet and keep going and all of that, when I don't think it's an accident or just a coincidence that we have such a mental health crisis in this country, and people really struggling with their mental health. Everyone, knows somebody who has died, or everyone is going to experience grief. So I think we need to get a lot better at talking about it, dealing with it, normalizing grief, normalizing going to therapy, and all those kind of things, which sadly have become taboo.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think when you were talking about the Hungarian traditions, I was thinking a lot about Mexico and the Day of the Dead. And I was always feeling like that, what an amazing thing that would be to have here, that we could all have one day where we remember. And it's also very uplifting and fun and a party. And, it doesn't always have to be this. I think maybe it's like, because we've repressed it, and this was certainly my experience, it's like you spend such a long time repressing it, and you think, oh my gosh, if I start crying about this, then I'm never going to stop, or it's going to upset everybody around me. It's just, and so I just can't. I have to keep it all in. And it's actually like, if you do let it out, and it ends up not being quite as dramatic as if you're, consciously dealing with it from an early stage. And then it doesn't become such a scary thing to talk about. And so, I think that we do need, like you say, normalizing therapy. I used to lie. Well, I used to not tell people that I was going to therapy because I felt like ashamed of it, and I think it, for the next generation, it's changing a lot, thankfully. But it would be interesting, actually, for you to share about how the process was to find a therapist. Was the therapist bereavement focused?
So again, this came through IG for me. I think had I had to go to a therapist in person, it might have been a different story. But this was during the pandemic. And again, I had counselors and therapists like yourself starting to follow me or interact with me. And then other grievers talking about therapy. And I was like, so it's kind of there's a percolation period where I was reading these stories and thinking, because again, like everybody else, there was this shame attached to therapy, or you're not coping, or you're going crazy, or, whatever it is, was making me kind of steer away from it. But gradually I thought, you know what, I'm not coping. How I'm behaving to the people around me who love me, it's not great. And I know I need to deal with whatever's going on. I felt like I'd reached the top of the pressure cooker. So I just started looking through Instagram, I was looking at various therapists, counselors. I went through a few, and I kind of knew instinctively ones that wouldn't be able to help me. They didn't get through the crap, basically, that I put up, all the masks. And then I met the right one, and she just stopped me in my tracks, and she said, okay, let's just stop there, Emma. What's really going on? No. And that was that. I was like, oh gosh, she's got my number. She knows. And also, like a lot of yoga teachers, I struggled financially with the pandemic, still am. So therapy is expensive, private therapy. So she gave me a 50% discount. Because I said, I'm sorry, I would love to have therapy with you. I've gone to an introductory session, but I can't afford it. And she gave me this. She says, Emma, everything you've told me, I really want to help you. She was lovely, and she still is very kind. And so that was another help for me. So I would meet her. I still meet her when I can afford to, through Zoom. And technically the session's 50 minutes, but it always goes way over. And she welcomes that, and she's one in a million, really. So I was introduced to things I'd never heard of. I'd never heard of somatic healing, which is a lot of what she does with me. There's all kinds of things that she brings to it: Gestalt therapy, Gestalt healing, and it's hard work. And that's the other thing. If I'd known how hard it was, gosh, I think I'd have been a chicken and not gone, because it's so hard. I had no idea how exposing and how you have to work. I hadn't realized that, to get through to what's happening. So she brought all these methods to me, and she also brought a lot of coping mechanisms for me, situations where I would get anxious, situations from the past as well, because I think that's an interesting thing, we have to look not just at the grief in isolation, but how we're coping. It relates to things that might have gone on in the past, traumatic events, etc. So all that had to be dredged up, out of the murk before we even got to the grief. So she does have a specific focus on grief, but she also has a focus on trauma therapy and lots of other therapies experience. So yeah, whatever's going on for me, we deal with that, and she brings the right method to it. If it's not working, if I'm being resistant, she'll bring another method to help me. So it's been really liberating. I say it's hard work, but it's worth the work because it's really liberating. Just to be able to see your patterns, have another eye on your patterns and where it's coming from, things that you might not have even connected, to your past. And it's empowering because then you can move forward with the tools that you've been given. And it's kind of like mental floss, like yoga is. It's like mental floss. You just feel, if you broke your leg, you do something about it. You should do the same with your mind. If it's not coping, it's getting overwhelmed, then you need to clear it out. So yeah, I see therapy as being a really liberating process. It was hard at first for me to talk about it, but then I made the decision that I'm going to talk about this because I truly believe vulnerability is strength. I really do. And I feel that talking about it enables other people to talk about it and share what they're feeling. Particularly my position as a yogi, people make assumptions, that I'm all love and light, that I don't have any problems and all that kind of nonsense. So I always tell everybody what's going on, that I'm as, a big old mess like everybody else is, trying to do my best, and therapy is part of that. So I always tell people that I go to therapy and that I'm proud that I go to therapy.
Yeah, right. I think what you're sharing is so helpful to people, and how, if you're somebody right now that's listening and you're thinking about getting a therapist, speak to a few people, see who resonates for you. And it's going to be hard work, but it's going to be completely worth it. And I think that's another reason that people are, repress their grief, because again, it's hard to feel, we don't want to feel all of these things. We want to numb out, or we want to just feel the positive things, and that's not having the true experience of our whole emotional range and being a human being. Like you said, none of us are perfect. None of us have got all of our stuff together. It's life and vulnerability. I think we can all thank Brené Brown for really bringing out vulnerability is strength. It's hard to cry in front of people. It's so
gosh, it's so hard.
Yeah.
Yeah, I find that so hard still with a therapist who sees it all. But it's important, and I think it's difficult as well with people around you, because people still believe all these things about therapy, including my own family. People just ran for the hills as soon as I said I was going to therapy, and they don't want to hear about it. It makes them feel uncomfortable. So it's also, it has an effect on the people around you in positive ways, like the communities that you can touch or understand what you're going through, but also in negative ways. I think because of how people have been brainwashed about these things or absorbed these notions about what mental health is. But that shouldn't stop us forging ahead. But you do have to be courageous to do that, I think. I've had a lot of fear around these things. It's not been easy to do these things, but I think ultimately this is what needs to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
and it is expensive, but it's also like an investment in your life, like a really important one. And people, I think, are becoming more conscious of the fact that, like, what would you rather spend your money on, like helping yourself, or going out for more dinners, or buying new shoes and things like that. Like you said, we are in a pandemic of a mental health crisis here. And I heard recently that we have the worst mental health amongst young children in the whole of Europe.
Sad.
It's really sad. Yeah. So we need more adults to not be afraid of like helping themselves in these ways.
Yeah,
for sure.
totally agree. Yeah.
And I've asked each participant, each person that I've interviewed on this series, like how you would interpret the term conscious grief.
Conscious grief, I would see, is beginning with awareness that, yes, I am grieving. It sounds kind of silly, but I think some people don't realize they are grieving because they're told they're meant to have been over this in a few months, or they've been told by their employer that, you know, you've had so many days grief leave and now you're back to work and everything's back to normal. So I think being conscious is acknowledging that you are grieving and that grief is going to last the rest of your life. Overwhelming as that can sound, you know, and I certainly went through a period of saying, oh my God, is this my life now? This is how it's going to be, because there is a definite before and after. But then you can choose how the after is. You know, it doesn't have to be doom and gloom the whole time. You have the grief ways, but you also have the joy, the hope, how you're carrying your loved one forward and how you're doing that and the work that you're doing in their memory. So for me, that's being conscious initially in awareness, but then conscious in action. And as a yogi, we know that yoga means skill in action. So for me, I would see one of my roles now that I've learned this stuff to pass it on. So that's why I call myself a grief activist as well, in that I do things. I talk about things. I involve people in these conversations. I do grief festivals now. I do various things to normalize and to keep it in the spotlight. And I think that's a conscious thing to do. And then it draws other conscious workers like yourself, like other grief workers together, and it draws grievers together. So it kind of snowballs in a really positive way. And that's what I would see as being conscious grief.
I love that. Thank you, Emma. I can tell that you're so brilliant with words, with your articulation.
Thanks to therapy, eh?
Yeah. Excuse me.
Who knew?
Who knew? And just before we finish, is there anything else that you'd like to share before we wrap up, that you'd like to impart or say to people who are listening?
I would just say, and I was, back, even just 2 years ago, I was in a very different space with the grief to where I am now. So I would say acknowledge that this is painful. It is really painful. Acknowledge that you feel very overwhelmed, that you feel tired, that people don't understand, that you feel like you're on your own in this. I'd like to reinforce that you're not. There's lots of us who feel like this, and you don't have to suffer. You can feel the pain without suffering, and find the things that work for you. And they might be different from what worked for me. For me, obviously, yoga works, therapy works, connecting with nature, writing, kind of therapeutic writing, talking and connecting with other grief workers and other grievers. Those things work for me. Find what works and keep pursuing it, and reach out if you need help. That would be the big one for me. I know it's really difficult. I know, but reach out, because there's always somebody there who can help.
Amazing, Emma. That's so helpful. Thank you very, very much for everything that you've shared. And can you tell people how they can find you? And we will also put a link underneath this to your website or your Instagram. So yeah, let people know how they can find you.
Yeah, so my website is www.emmaliveyoga.com. I have a YouTube channel which has a dedicated Yoga for Grief playlist, and the classes are 10-15 minutes long. So if you're exhausted, they're not too long, and really they're centered around the breath. So it's not so much what you're doing with your body as how you're honoring your grief, and they're centered around key emotions like anger, denial, emotional fatigue, and they're all free. So you can tap into those on the website, which will take you to YouTube. There's also the writing that I've done around grief on the website. There's links to the death festivals I've been involved in, and extracts from the memoir that I've written, You Can't Hug a Butterfly. You can also find me, of course, on Instagram at Conally-Yoga. And that's really where my active grief community is as well. And yeah, feel free to reach out and connect. I'll be happy to talk to you.
Oh, so kind. Thank you, Emma. I really appreciate
Welcome.
it. Yeah, and it feels like a neat thing that you're here, after watching the first series. So
yeah, come full circle. It's a big honor. So thank you very much for asking me to be part of this. I was very honored. I thought, wow. 2 years ago, I was listening to this, really struggling, and I realized how far I'd come, but I also realized what good work you've done with other people as well. And doing this series, that it really helps somebody like me start to honor my grief and start to reach out and find the help that I needed. So thank you for that.
Oh, bless you. And thank you very much to everybody who's been listening.
Yeah, thank you.